Welcome to Democracy Nerd. I'm Jefferson Smith. The perception of victimhood is a powerful force in politics used to inspire supporters, attack opponents. Joining us today to talk about the perception of victimhood is Professor in American Politics at University of Mississippi, Miles Armaly. Professor, welcome. The author of a new study, Why Me? The Role of Perceived Victimhood in American Politics. First, let's just establish or challenge the premise, Professor. Perceived victimhood, you make distinct perceived victimhood to actual victimhood. Maybe that's sort of obvious, but give us the paradigmatic example of where that divide, where that cleavage really matters.
There are, of course, genuine victims in politics. Sometimes that may just be somebody who's getting the short end of whatever winners and losers there are in politics. And then, of course, political systems have historically oppressed. So there are genuine victims. We're very careful to distinguish the perceived victim from the genuine victim. In fact, we don't even try to get into the concept of genuine victimhood. The perceived victim is simply somebody who feels that way, whether or not they're experiencing any short-term victimization or they've been subject to any sort of longer-term historical oppression or from a group that has experienced that type of victimhood.
Where have you seen the biggest, obviously the one that probably comes to mind, particularly for people who did not vote to reelect the previous president, is the perceived victimhood of the white male who had power historically, lots and lots, and might now have 7% less. Is that basically what we're talking about?
No. So we see different manifestations of perceived victimhood and different people expressing various levels of perceived victimhood at any given time. But in our study, we don't find that there's a great deal of difference across various groups. So white men are slightly higher in victimhood than other groups, but not to a great degree. So we're not really just talking about, say, white male grievances or anybody who has historically had power that has now been diminished. We're not simply discussing their grievances. But again, we do see them, at least in public discourse, make a lot of noise. So that temptation to argue that those individuals are the most or perceive the highest levels of victimhood is very understandable.
Two manifestations of victimhood that you identify: the egocentric, I deserve more, and the systemic, the system is rigged against me and against mine. Are these two victimhoods, do they have special flavor or maybe even unique flavor to partisan divisions, or do they go beyond that?
They go beyond that, at least in the general sense. So we do find that the two forms or the two manifestations or flavors or whatever you'd like to call them of victimhood do relate to, for instance, support for Donald Trump in different ways, such that those who register high in egocentric victimhood support Trump and those who register highly in systemic victimhood did not support Trump. That's not to say, however, that those who are high in egocentric victimhood will always support Republican candidates or vice versa.
Can you explain, you make the case that it's a central theme, that victimhood is a central theme in modern political messaging. Trump rallies revel in victimhood, even though we now know that the demography of the people who engaged in seditious riots at the Capitol were not poorer than average, were not less educated than average, were not more aggrieved than average. Is there and oddly, maybe not oddly, for those of us now who are aware of your book and aware of this idea, the victimhood persisted even after a political victory. Mm-hmm. Is it essential now to cue victimhood for candidates to be politically successful?
I think it's always been a little bit necessary. It's always been a part of politics. Again, sometimes we are victims in the sense that we're not getting what we think we deserve from politics. So there's always been this element of something's wrong, I'm the candidate to fix it. This is not across the partisan divide. We see this in primaries. I'm a better Democrat than the other guy to help you. I'm the best Republican to help you. get over these issues. So there is a little bit of victimhood cueing that has always sort of been there. What seems different now, and to be clear, we don't have overtime data about how people are feeling in terms of their victimhood, but it does seem that modern politics utilizes this sense of victimhood much more explicitly. I think it was a December 5th rally in Georgia, Trump went on and on about victimhood. He was using the language, and this was well after our study, he was using the language of victimhood. So that
he probably read your study, from what
I,
we understand. He probably reads just about every social science study there is.
that's right. He's the one reader so far. But yeah, this idea of using victimhood in such a poignant way seems new.
You also draw the conclusion, I'm interested in your methodology here, that higher levels of egocentric victimhood were likely to be Trump supporters, whereas systemic victimhood, people who expressed that or manifested that were more likely to vote against Trump in 2016. First of all, what was your methodology? How do you identify which is that? You just sort of count up sentences and speeches? You do it through polling? How do you figure that out?
So we use a series of nationally representative surveys. So all told, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,300 people were surveyed, and they match the demographics of the United States in terms of race, sex, several other features, importantly, ideology and things like that, and partisanship, right? So that it looks like the US population. And to measure the two manifestations of victimhood, we asked a series of questions, 4 per variant, and we validate those through various statistical methods. And what we find is that they can be high in both. These are not mutually exclusive forms of victimhood. A person can be high in egocentric victimhood and high in systemic victimhood. One way to think about it is that some people hand wring about their lot in life, some people finger point, but some people do both. Some people do one in one situation and a different one in a different situation. What we find is that those who agree with statements like, I get less than I deserve, they are more likely to have voted for Donald Trump in 2016. People who agree with statements like, the world is doing it, and they point to higher order systems that are causing oppression, they were less likely to self-report voting for Trump in 2016. So methodologically, everything is survey-based.
So what do you chalk that up to?
Well, we think Trump is very effective at cueing egocentric victimhood, making people feel like they're the victim. Perhaps that's one of his greatest accomplishments as a politician, is sort of making this fervor happen where people felt like they were not getting enough, they're owed something. And we chalk this up to a lot of different things. We've seen white nationalism, we've seen economic insecurity, all these various things sort of explain this. Trump is very good at making people feel victimized. So we think that that is one of the reasons that those high in egocentric victimhood supported Trump. As for why systemic victimhood, those high in systemic victimhood are less likely to have voted for Trump, Trump is the system. Trump is, the major elements of politics that may be problematic for some people, and that sort of those types of individuals who view those systems as being oppressive are unlikely to support an individual who is an elite before he was a politician, and those are the types of things that we think explain those relationships.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering how much it's about Trump and how much of it's about the voting base, right? There is one of my critiques of recent political analysis is putting so much of the last blank number of years at the feet of the former president, recognizing that that dude did not start the fire, right? That he was more potentially the rattler of a snake than the head of one. And Yochai Benkler wrote Network Propaganda and made the case that made the data-driven case that now that there is a constabulary, I'm trying to avoid charged descriptors. Well, I'll just use his term as a network of propaganda that feeds each other. And if anybody within that network departs from its orthodoxy, they are excised or ignored. And that the way to yield power within it, and this is, over a third of the American media consumers, and and that Donald Trump did not create that. Donald Trump masterfully tapped into it. And it seems to me that and therefore that informs some of my curiosity about this. How much do you think was, pushed by the president versus how much of it did he benefit by or merely exploit?
I think your intuition is spot on here. I would say that we can lay a good amount of the blame at the president at the time, and whether that was Trump or not. We're very careful to not tie victimhood to Trump specifically. It could be any president, and we're not exactly certain the ways in which victimhood will relate to support for Joe Biden. I will note that in our study, we used both Donald Trump and Joe Biden to experimentally manipulate the ways that people are victimized or feel victimized using the same language from both candidates in 2019 or 2020 rather. We were able to exacerbate the degree to which people felt themselves to be victims. So this is definitely not just a Trump phenomenon. But again, I do think he uniquely tapped into it in ways that other politicians either maybe are wary to do or are unable to.
I want to talk about the word. That does victimhood potentially cheapen things that really matter? And it's like, oh, victimhood is a political device. Well, wait a minute. Maybe it's just identifying harm or identifying problems that are caused, right? If there's kids who are dying because a lake is polluted, if there are people who can't afford their health care, so we're going bankrupt, is them calling that out, or is a politician calling that out, engaging in victimhood or embracing victimhood or exploiting victimhood or identifying problems, seeing people who are suffering from those problems and doing what is the most virtuous manifestation of political power, which is trying to solve problems.
Right.
Talk about the word.
So I think you get into something that's really important. It's not desirable to be a victim. That's a bad state of affairs. If you're in a situation where you're genuinely the victim of a poisoned lake, or you're a child in Flint, Michigan, you don't want to be that victim. However, it seems that people understand the power of victimhood. The allure of victimhood for a non-victim is that it grants some amount of social deference. So there's this concept that in the contemporary moral hierarchy, victims receive extra status. And one way to achieve that status for oneself is to claim to be a victim or to feel like a victim, whether or not it's true. One example may be that some people see something like the Me Too movement, and they see somebody who, in their eyes, has not achieved status, right? We have these virtues of hard work in the United States, and some people have been given a platform, not through hard work, not through bootstraps. And they think, well, that's perhaps not deserved. They then think, well, if I can utilize that victimhood to receive my own platform, that's sort of a shortcut. So I can't say for sure whether it cheapens genuine victimhood. That's perhaps something we'll have to wait and see. But there is certainly the danger that utilizing victimhood for one's gain is problematic. And I think culturally, as a society, we need to decide whether victimhood claims deserve that status all the time, or if we want to take sort of a more ad hoc approach to deciding whether we should be deferential to certain individuals societally.
Well, let's spell that out. So I heard you say two things. I heard you say that victimhood builds status. That's helpful understanding, at least for me. The other thing you said was that is problematic. How come? How come problematic? Maybe people who have been harmed and who are willing to say so out loud, maybe they deserve more status. Why problematic?
Those are the two things I said. I won't draw a straight line between them. It's potentially problematic for the very reason that people can claim victimhood and potentially receive that status, which then certainly diminishes the genuine status we should be conferring on people who deserve it because they have experienced something and they are speaking out in a way that may help others.
Got it. Uh, so how do we, what I find interesting about people who've done excellent research, helpful research, or advancing the discussion, I treat it like the high school kid or like the college kid who wants to jump to, okay, so what do we do? I'll hesitate on that question unless you want to jump to it at some point, but I still have those urges. Okay, so what do we do about it? But let's keep going through some of the bits. We'll just tease what do we do about it until the end. That'll keep people sticking around. 3 forms of victimhood. You also identify legal, sociocultural, self-defined. Explain more.
Yeah, so the work that exists from psychology and other fields that discuss victimhood identify those 3 types. So there's the legal victim, somebody who has been the victim of a crime or something like that. There's the sociocultural. Those are the victims of cultural or social oppression. Historically, in the United States, historically, people of color, females, those types of groups. And then the self-defined victim is the one on which we focus, the perceived victim, which is simply a psychological state wherein one believes themselves to be a victim. They call themselves a victim, or they feel that they're a victim. They don't necessarily need to agree with the label for it to sort of operate the way it would if somebody said, yes, I am a victim.
The paradox to some degree of victimhood as an undesirable trait, yet enhancing status. I think I understand that from almost a social development standpoint, right? If somebody, there's somebody of our tribe who is injured, we as a tribe is a healthy instinct, right? We got to go and take care of that person if we wanted to deal with it in social science terms, Rawlsian terms, behind a veil of ignorance, but for the grace of God go I, or in religious terms, what I just said. Help us understand that paradox, an undesirable thing to be a victim, something we can criticize as being a victim. If you go to say, oh, you're always playing the victim, that's an insult to somebody. And at the same time, it seems to build status. Help us understand that.
Well, I think there's 2 things there. The first is that one doesn't have to say, yes, I'm a victim to feel like one, and then that still bears on politics. And they could, associate with groups that perhaps make claims of victimhood without using the term or without using that terminology. The second part is that receiving the badge of honor without the trauma would be a desirable way to go about it. One does not want to have been victimized, but they still may wish to receive the social status. So they don't have to go through the victimization. They don't have to go through the potential trauma of being a victim. And then on the other side, they can claim, hey, I'm a victim. That's sort of the best of both worlds for them. They don't have to experience the terrible parts of it, but they get the status from it, or at least that may be a motivation.
How important is blame with respect to victimhood? In order to get victimhood status, do you have to also be able to tell the story about the oppressor or the victimizer?
Potentially. Blame is sort of a very crucial component of victimhood. Every time somebody's victimized, they potentially have somebody to blame. In politics, this works quite well. You can blame the other party. And a second element of blame is that there is sort of a hero. There's somebody that comes along and says, I can fix this. I am not the one to blame. I can heal. So there are those varying elements of blame in victimhood, at least in the political context, that manifest as support for candidates and support for various policies that can fix the victimization. We want to correct the political thing that is victimizing us, the thing that we're blaming. So we support policies, politicians, and parties that can do that.
What did you learn about in terms of connection between perceived victimhood and, well, heck, maybe even narcissism, but also, and maybe in the context of assigning that blame, but yeah.
Yeah, so in validating any measure, any sort of social scientific measure or psychological measure, it's important to distinguish between what we're talking about, victimhood, and existing measures, things like narcissism. So we do relate them. People who tend to be more narcissistic tend to be higher in both forms of victimhood. That being said, they are, of course, distinct concepts. What we learn is that, there's a little bit, in both forms of victimhood, there's a little bit of, say, entitlement. For the egocentric victim, he or she thinks, well, I'm not getting as much as I deserve. There's two elements there. There's the deservingness, and then there's the deprivation. So all of those things tie into narcissism, group narcissism, individual narcissism, and sort of state narcissism, which is sort of present narcissism rather than the trait-based. All of those do correlate to our measures of victimhood. So we could see these things working together, but again, it's not, we're sort of measuring different concepts.
Relationship between victimhood and political orientation before, but you talked about the likelihood to vote. Egocentric victimhood claims seem to match up closer to Trump voters. Systemic victimhood seem to match closer to voting against the former president. But you say both egocentric and systemic victimhood can be found, in Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, everybody.
Yep.
Both manners of victimhood are impacted differently by candidates. Trump, for instance, never really blamed the system. Anything more you want to say on the political cleavage that is experienced or exploited? Well,
so Trump sometimes talked about the system, right? The swamp. I think people ended up taking that as here are just people he doesn't like. But it may be worth considering how his description of elites in Washington and the swamp sort of manifested in his supporters. They think he is not the system, despite the fact that he was. Nevertheless, we do see that negative association between systemic victimhood and support for Trump. As for
there's all that talk about, once more the media is against me. I mean, that's a systemic victimhood claim, right? I mean, maybe it's egocentric because the media is after me, but talking about how, co-opting the phrase fake news to, instead of talking about actual mistakes of fact, to instead pivot that term and describe it as anything that is critical of the former president or of his media apparatus. You define that as systemic, or maybe that's just another different kind of egocentric, or maybe it's mixed?
It's probably mixed. So where we would see that, if we go back for just a second, where we were talking about, the attribution of blame, and it may be the case that people didn't, not the attribution of blame. If we go back to sort of societal deference to victims, people can make a victimhood claim and society can disagree. They can say, no, you are not the victim. It's possible that Trump, in making these claims that I'm the victim of the media, of elites, of the swamp, of the deep state, it could be that most people just didn't buy it. His supporters maybe did to varying degrees, his most hardcore supporters perhaps, but society is always able to deny the victimhood claim, and it's possible that a large swath of the mass public denied Trump's victimhood claim.
What do these results mean with respect to cueing feelings of victimhood and mobilization? It gets to the root of why victimhood yields power. So you said, well, it grants status. It sort of gives the stage, provides the floor to the person who's claiming victimhood. They get to, people retweet their stuff or listen to them, gives them maybe some modicum of moral authority. Does it also, therefore, or in addition or separate from that, persuade? Is it mostly a tool, therefore, to mobilize? There's something really at stake here, so I will get off my couch and actually do something, not only agree or disagree with something, but actually do more, maybe do the thing inside while still sitting on my couch. Say more about the root of the power of victimhood.
It could work in many different ways. So you could see the egocentric victim saying, I am sick of this. I'm going to get out. I'm going to stump. I'm going to put a sign in my yard. I'm going to make phone calls because I need this victimhood to end. But at the same time, you could see a systemic victim saying, well, the system's broken. There's nothing I can do. I can vote all I want, but the system at its root, at its heart, is still broken. And so we could see victimhood manifest, or rather having multiple consequences sort of depending on the individual. As for a unified consequence of victimhood in terms of mobilization, I think it's going to end up coming down to the candidate. Trump does such a wonderful job at mobilizing this victimhood and making people feel like victims and turning that into mobilization. If other candidates or politicians are less effective at making people feel that way, that latent victimhood, that latent perceived victimhood, may just not come to bear on certain elections.
In terms not only that power, but then how that power ends up getting exploited. You did a study and about how people can be made to feel victimized. You ran an experiment. As I understand it, you, after recording partisan preferences, participants were grouped up. The first wrote about a time that they were victimized. The second read the same fake quote about Trump or Biden fighting for the middle class. Spell out, walk us through this. It was interesting. Walk us through this study.
Yeah, so you described it pretty well. And so the first group, they just wrote about a time that they felt victimized in politics. They were able to say, I've never felt victimized in politics. What we found there is people felt victimized by all manner of objects in the political world. This was conducted in 2020, so a lot of people felt victimized by COVID-19, whether that be the shutdowns or the failure for the government to act. A lot of people felt victimized by Trump, by polarization. Some people said abortion. Some people said their race, their sex, all these types of things victimized people. What we then found is that relative to a group who did not write about their experiences, the people who did write about feeling victimized registered higher on both egocentric and systemic victimhood. So merely having them think about a time that they've been victimized in politics means they report feeling more victimized. For the second study, that the quote by both candidates, which was the identical quote, and it said something along the lines of, you've been victimized, you're the victims of so much, it's sad, I'm going to keep fighting for you. Those people who saw that also increased their level of reported victimhood, meaning it's not a Trump effect, it's not a Republican effect. Candidates of all stripes can cue victimhood. So in as much as people feel victimhood individually, in as much as it's a bottom-up phenomenon, it is also a top-down phenomenon where political elites can exacerbate feelings of victimhood.
Still getting back to the so what. Why I care is so there are fewer victims. Like the reason this court sits is that fewer people get harmed, roughly speaking, right? That the not just the greatest good of the greatest number, but the fewest people getting totally hosed. Now I recognize some of the so what is, well, let's make sure someone's psychological perception of that thing is not the same thing as the thing. I get that. Maybe that's most of the answer. It still then gets me the so what to the therefore what. Seems a lot rests on that. It was just, okay, well, don't play the victim. Well, what about people who are disenfranchised from being able to vote and are saying, this sucks because I don't get a chance to vote, or my family member, my community members are undercounted because they are systemically and systematically left out or pushed out or misled out of the process. So when is victimhood the kind of thing that's just a name for why the reason we care in the first place? And when is it sort of a counter rhetorical tool to make sure people don't bleat about what they're disappointed about?
Sure. And I think potentially this will be a disappointing response. In the perfect world, right? We somehow create utopia, and nobody is genuinely a victim. People are not disenfranchised. People are not systemically harmed. Everybody's doing well. The ideal society. I suspect there will still be perceived victims. There will still be people who say, but I'm still not getting enough. I'm still oppressed in some way. I'm still the victim of something. So as for how is it counter-rhetorical, I'm not sure. I'm not ready to state at the moment that I know a good way to make it so that we can stop people from using it rhetorically that doesn't also harm people who are genuine victims from making their claims.
Well, that gets me to the question. Okay, so what do we do? It seems like some of this is just being able to parse better, having a media that is diligent in trying to say, okay, some shared sense, building a shared sense of what is genuine, what is genuine harm, what is a genuine problem, what's a genuine shared vision of the good, and therefore it's contraposited as the bad or the thing that causes harm. What do we do about this? It's just, okay, we're aware of it, and now do it or don't do it, and use it as a political tool, and it makes for a good book and a fun conversation, all of which is good. We're all going to die one day. But yeah, so what do we do about it?
Yeah, so I've already created a utopia, so I might as well, describe how society should operate.
Check.
Yeah, I think what we have to do societally is make some tough decisions. Right there, we're already, in rough territory. But we have to make decisions about whether we think it's a good thing for people to receive status when they describe their victimhood. I think that there's a possibility for victimhood to be addressed, for genuine grievances to be addressed without necessarily giving people increased political voices. What we want is everybody to have voices, right? Rising tides lift all boats. We want everybody to have an equal voice. Sometimes they have to shout a little louder for that voice to be equal. The problem, of course, as we've been discussing, is that when people see that working, they start shouting loudly too about their grievances that are, for most people, we wouldn't consider them real grievances, or we would say, okay, you're aggrieved, but we don't agree that this is as problematic as you view it. So I think society has to decide if it's a good idea to be picking and choosing to whom we give extra status when we want people to come out and say things that are victimizing them. I think there is a way to have it both ways. I'm not exactly sure how that happens without harming people.
What's the next question you're interested in? Are you delving in on this subject more? Are you dealing with some of these questions further? Or are you going to write a book with a totally unrelated thing and just write about sports, which is tempting?
It is very tempting. It's been a weird time to be a political scientist the last number of years.
Also a hard time to be a Blazer fan. I will claim my own victim. We're the most snake bait franchise, I think, in any sport right now.
As a Detroit sports fan, I don't feel a great deal of sympathy for you.
Come on, man. You've had many championships. You have many championships.
Many championships
in my lifetime.
No Super Bowls, no World Series in my lifetime, but
Yeah, and you've had, I chalk it up to bad land use planning. Like you didn't create an urban growth boundary. You didn't create a regional government like Portland, Oregon did, and so you had a bunch of auto executives who moved out to Grosse Pointe. But you don't blame me for that. That's not my fault.
No, you're right. It's not your fault. Hey, look, Detroit's coming back. Don't skip out on Detroit. I
went to Detroit, man.
To the Midwest.
No, I went to Detroit, and I bet on Detroit, and in part because it's an undervalued asset, and you have such a culture of there's such a culture of innovation. That was the thing. I went on an ambassador's trip, like some certified fancy people plus me, and we went and I remarked at any number of things there, including a new phrase I learned, which is urban prairie, right? These city blocks that have been raised, not raised up, but raised to the ground with a Z. And we saw a deer, like in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
These old, beautiful vacant buildings. We saw all of that. But the thing that was newer to me that I hadn't come to grips with was that 100 years ago, it was Silicon Valley, right? That 100 years ago, that Detroit was not a center of machinery. It was the center of invention. And it was not merely industry, it was the industriousness that garnered it. So I find Detroit absolutely fascinating. And while I tease, I also find that the metro area choice, the policy choices, the urban policy choices, among the most important examples of urban development that there are. I know this gets off the topic from your book, but go Blazers.
Well, yeah, okay. All's fair. I'll support the Blazers as well. As for what's next, in this article, we note that there's a couple of forms of victimhood that we don't delve into. One is an other-oriented or sort of an accusatory victimhood. As you noted a few minutes ago, people say, "Oh, you're playing the victim card," and that's a bad thing to say. It's a bad thing to be caught doing. We're interested in that and how that plays out politically. So, if people perceive a group, for instance, to believe themselves to be victims, but an individual doesn't think that group is a victim, are they less willing to provide benefits for them, even if they accept that group is disadvantaged in some way? So those are the types of things that we're looking into next with regard to victimhood.
Anything I should have asked you that I didn't?
One thing that I think is interesting that I've been getting from some of the other outlets that we've talked about victimhood.
We like to think of ourselves as an outlet. That might trump us up a little bit, might give us too much credit, but I like to think of us as an outlet. But anyway, okay, go ahead. Some of the other outlets.
You're self-deprecating, and I just hear that as victimhood language, right?
No, man, the man is keeping me down. If it weren't for these Facebook algorithms, everybody would care deeply about, deeper delving into social science topics.
The man is keeping everybody down. The truth is the truth. That's irrespective of victimhood. But one thing that we keep being asked is, well, there are victims, right? And we've been talking about historically disadvantaged peoples, but what we've been seeing in like a lot of comments sections are people saying there are people who don't have health insurance, there are people who don't have a living wage, and sort of. So I guess if there was any topic of conversation, to sort of expand on here is, what do we do with modern victims who are not necessarily historical victims, and sort of how does that fit into the narrative?
For example?
All of the millions of Americans who are underemployed, who are underinsured, because we have sort of bifurcated systems of government. And, correct me if I'm mistaken, but you could work at a place in Portland for $15 an hour and then go to a nearby city for, $7.25, even though it's the same job. That's a failure of government response to address the needs of its citizens. And
you
so
have to go to Washington State for that. If you had to, if you went to other places in Oregon, you'd get about $13, or I think the lowest is $11.25. But yeah, it matters. But they did it based on wealth. I think indexed by maybe average housing value. How they ended up doing by city. It's actually sort of interesting system. Shout out to Caitlin Baggett, and North Star and the North Star Civic Foundation, who helped offer the idea of indexing minimum wages to at least somewhat, so people in the rural areas still get a minimum wage, and yet it relates to cost of living to some degree. It's sort of an mildly elegant solution. But anyway, I cut you off.
So yeah, right. So like the indexing minimum wage thing is great, because like government could have indexed minimum wage to something, and depending on what, our minimum wage would be $22 now, $24, depending on what you index it to. And the failure to do something like that is going to be a net positive for everybody. That is a time when we can point to government and say, well, it seems like we're a little bit victimized by government right now. So we tend to think of genuine victims in terms of those who have been historically disadvantaged. But there is sort of a new crop of people who are potentially genuine victims. And we've been getting a lot of questions about that from readers of our
college graduates, right? Like nobody would have thought of a college graduate as a victim 20 years ago. 30 years ago, they weren't graduating with 6 figures of debt.
That's right.
So it is, I mean, I felt a little bit ham-fisted in this conversation. I appreciate your patience with me a little, because even just the definition of terms and recognize, because to me, it's 2 moves away from what do we view as good, bad, important, harm, causing of harm in the world, right? It gets really closely, really quickly to basic existential and even philosophical questions. Yeah. Yeah,
of course. We did our best in our study to really, really avoid getting into that, but we of course understand that it brings up these thoughts and what's good and what's right. But at the end of the day, politics is there to sort of solve what the ills of society are, and the hope is to achieve what can be achieved, to bring us to what's right and good. And we design systems and institutions with that in mind. Whether they succeed is a different question, but we design with that in mind. So I think victimhood, in a weird way, is inherent in any conversation about politics.
Well, Professor, I want to say thank you. We've been talking to Miles Armaly, Professor of Political Science at the University of Mississippi. I'd love to talk again about the University of Mississippi. Oh, I should say, ask one thing. What are the politics like at the University of Mississippi? Similar to other universities around the country, because of its origins, including its historic importance. Yeah, what's the political landscape like at Ole Miss?
It's probably wise for me to speak very measuredly here. But the thing is,
do you have tenure yet?
No.
Okay.
So
yeah, we'll be careful. We'll be careful. Miles is roughly speaking in favor of the apparati at University of Mississippi.
Right. Any university system is interesting because there's distinct groups of individuals that all have different motivations and different points of view and everything. Our student body is no different than other student bodies. There's a mix of everything politically. I think that's pretty similar for most levels of the institution as well. And sometimes you'll read some things in the news about the higher ups. And I will say some of the time those things are not in the greatest context. But it's I think the politics here are not that different than the politics at most universities. Sometimes they should be doing more, sometimes they should be saying less, but again, roughly speaking, I'm in favor of the university. There have been sort of no major, nothing for me to quit.
Well, I want to say thanks to Professor Armaly. Thank you for watching Democracy Nerd. Thank you for being a Democracy Nerd. Maybe several of you are. Maybe we can count on two hands the number of Democracy Nerds that are amongst us. Thanks for doing that. Thanks, Professor, for being with us.
Thank you.